You have heard him called, awakened. You have seen his face carved in stone, eyes half closed, mouth carrying the faint trace of a smile that seems to know something you do not. It is easy, looking at that stillness, to believe he was born beyond the reach of sorrow. That grief and fear and longing were things that happened to ordinary people and never to him. This is not so. Before he was anything else, he was a child who lost his mother within days of his own birth. He never knew her voice. He was raised by an aunt who loved him, and still, somewhere in him, there must have been a room that stayed empty, a shape where a mother should have been. His father built walls around him, not stone walls only, but walls made of comfort, of music, of gardens arranged to keep out anything that might remind the boy that bodies age, that bodies sicken, that bodies end. For years this worked. Then, one afternoon, on a ride outside those walls, he saw an old man bent nearly in half by the weight of his own years. He saw a man shaking with fever. He saw a corpse being carried toward burning. And he saw, last, a wandering seeker with nothing, whose face nonetheless held something the young prince had never seen inside his gardens. Peace that did not depend on the garden staying green. Try to imagine for a moment what those walls actually contained. Musicians were kept nearby so that silence, which sometimes carries hard questions with it, would never have the chance to settle in a room where he sat alone. The gardens were tended so that no dying leaf would linger long enough to be noticed. Servants were told, it is said, to remove from his path anyone who appeared old or unwell or grieving, so thoroughly that for years he believed, in some untested part of himself, that such things simply happened elsewhere, to other families, in other kingdoms. This was not cruelty on his father's part. It was love, the same love that builds coverings over flowering trees, the same fear that mistakes shielding a person from reality for protecting them. And it worked, for a while, the way such shielding often does. Then it stopped working in a single afternoon, the way such shielding always eventually does, because reality does not require permission to enter a life, however carefully that life has been arranged against it. You already know how the story is usually told after this. He renounced his home, sat beneath a tree, and rose enlightened. But this telling skips the years in between, and it is exactly those years that matter for what you are here to hear. He tried to escape suffering the way many of us try. First, he tried to outrun it through starvation and severity, denying his body food and rest and warmth, believing that if he punished the flesh enough, the flesh would stop demanding anything from him. He nearly died from this. His ribs, it is said, could be felt through his stomach when he pressed his hand there, and when he touched his spine, he could feel it from the front, as though the two sides of his body had nearly met with nothing left between them. He sat for long stretches in this condition, certain that one more effort of will, one more season of denial would finally deliver the peace he was seeking. Companions who had followed him this far watched him grow weaker by the week, and some among them likely wondered whether he would simply die there, unremarkable. One more ascetic among many who had starved themselves in pursuit of a stillness that kept receding the closer they came to collapse. And even at the edge of death, the ache of being alive did not leave him. Suffering did not step aside because he suffered nobly. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Nobility is not currency that suffering accepts. He learned, slowly and at great cost, that denying the body was no wiser than drowning it in pleasure. Both were attempts to bargain with something that cannot be bargained with. Both left him exactly where he started, only more exhausted. What changed was not that suffering ended. He was struck by illness in his later years. He suffered from pain in his back that forced him, more than once, to lie down and let a disciple speak in his place. He lost his closest students before he himself died, and grief for them was written plainly on him, not hidden as something beneath his dignity to feel. His own cousin turned against him and tried, more than once, to see him harmed. His community argued and split and caused him what the old records describe plainly as sorrow. And in the end, he died as almost anyone might, from illness following a meal offered to him in good faith by someone who meant only kindness. None of this was covered over by the tradition that came after him. It was left in plainly because the point was never that he escaped the human condition. The point was that he found a way to carry it that cost him less. Here is the teaching that holds the whole of what follows. He taught that when pain arrives, it strikes you the way an arrow strikes, sudden, real, sometimes unavoidable. A body ages. A person you love leaves or dies, or changes into someone you no longer recognize. Plans fail. This is the first arrow, and against the first arrow, there is often little to be done except to let it land. But then, he taught, a second arrow follows the first, one that we, ourselves, fire into our own wound. This second arrow is not the loss itself, but the story we build around the loss, the resistance, the argument with reality, the belief that this should not be happening, the fear that if it is happening, then something has gone wrong with us specifically, that we alone are being punished or singled out or failed. The first arrow you often cannot prevent. The second arrow, he taught, is the one that can be examined, loosened, and in time met without flinching. This is not the same as saying it can be avoided entirely. Suffering less is not the same promise as suffering never. He suffered less, not because he was spared, because he stopped shooting the second arrow quite so often and quite so hard. Consider something far smaller than the losses he faced. Only so, the shape of the teaching becomes easier to see in your own days. Rain falls on a morning you had planned for something outdoors. That is the first arrow, small, ordinary, largely outside your control. The second arrow arrives a moment later, in the thought that the day is now ruined, that you are somehow unlucky in a way others are not, that this single change in weather has confirmed some larger unfairness running through your whole life. Notice how much heavier the second arrow is than the first. The rain itself lasts an afternoon. The story you build around the rain can last the whole week, coloring conversations that have nothing to do with weather at all. This is true of losses far greater than a rained-out afternoon as well, and it was true, apparently, even for him. The teaching does not ask you to stop feeling the rain. It asks you to notice, gently, whenever you have picked up a second arrow and begun aiming it at yourself. Grief offers a heavier version of the same pattern. Losing someone you love is a first arrow, unavoidable, and there is no teaching anywhere, his included, that asks you to feel this loss any less deeply than it deserves to be felt. But grief often arrives accompanied by a second arrow of its own, a voice insisting you should already be further along than you are, that others have recovered faster, that some flaw in you is prolonging what should already have eased. That second arrow is not grief itself. It is judgment about grief, laid on top of grief, doubling its weight. He suffered these losses too, and nothing in the old accounts suggests he was asked to grieve less, only that he was, in time, spared the added burden of believing his grief itself was a failure. What follows are 9 lessons drawn from what he came to understand, each carried by a small story in the old style, offered not as history but as illustration. None of these stories claim to be his own words. They are offered the way a teacher today might still offer a story to make an old truth walkable. Listen the way you would listen to someone who has already made the walk you are making, tired in the same places you are tired, and willing now to tell you what he found along the way. Lesson 1 is called attachment. It is one of the most misunderstood words in this whole teaching, because people hear it and believe it means you must love less, want less, hold less closely to the people and things that matter to you. This is not what is meant. Attachment, as he taught it, is not the love itself. It is the demand, quiet or loud, that the loved thing remain exactly as it is, forever, unchanged on your terms. Love can exist without that demand. In fact, it exists more freely without it. Clinging is not devotion grown large. Clinging is fear wearing the mask of devotion. There was once a gardener who tended a single flowering tree given to him by his grandfather. Every spring it bloomed white, and every autumn the blossoms fell, and this had always been the pattern of the tree, blooming and falling as trees do. But one year the gardener noticed the falling blossoms scattered across his path, and something in him could not bear it. He decided the falling was a kind of loss he would no longer permit. He built a covering over the tree, a roof of woven branches and cloth, so that no wind could carry the blossoms away, so that each flower would stay exactly where it opened, held in place. At first, this seemed to work. The blossoms did not fall, but the covering that kept the wind away also kept away the sun the tree needed and kept away the rain that fed its roots. By midsummer, the leaves had begun to yellow. By the second spring, the tree bloomed only a handful of pale, weak flowers, and by the third spring, it didn't bloom at all. The gardener, grieving, finally removed the covering and found the tree already half dead beneath it. An old neighbor, seeing this, said to him, "You didn't lose the blossoms to the wind. You lost the tree to your fear of losing the blossoms. The wind was never the danger. Your hand, closed too tightly, was the danger." This is what attachment does when it is mistaken for care. It is not that you should stop loving the tree, or the person, or the season of your life that you are in now. It is that the very holding meant to protect the bloom can become the thing that starves it. Detachment, properly understood, is not coldness. It is clarity. It is the willingness to let the wind move through what you love without believing the wind is your enemy. You may notice, if you are honest, some version of that covering in your own life. Perhaps it is a friendship you have overprotected, checking constantly for signs that it is changing, unable to let it breathe or shift with the seasons of both your lives. Perhaps it is a version of yourself, younger or more certain or less tired, that you keep trying to preserve under glass, refusing to let it grow into whatever you are becoming now. You are not asked to stop caring for these things. You're asked only to notice where your hand has closed so tightly around them that they can no longer receive what they need to stay alive. This is not a fault in you. It is an old, human, entirely understandable fear. The fear that if you loosen your grip even slightly, everything will be swept away. And yet the gardener's tree teaches something quieter and more durable than that fear allows for. What is loved freely tends to last, in its own way, longer than what is loved by force. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes only from clinging, distinct from the tiredness of ordinary living. You may recognize it as the tightness behind the eyes after checking again whether someone still feels the way you need them to feel. You may recognize it in the low, constant hum of worry that accompanies something going well, the fear underneath good fortune that asks, quietly and relentlessly, how soon this will be taken away. This is the covering going up over the tree, plank by plank, built with entirely good intentions and no ill will at all, and still slowly starving the very thing it was meant to protect. Loosening the covering does not mean loving less. It means trusting that what is genuinely alive between you and another person, or between you and a season of your own life, does not require constant shelter from the weather in order to keep blooming. Lesson 2 is called impermanence. Of all the teachings, this is the one most often heard and least often believed, not intellectually, but in the bones, in the place where decisions actually get made. Everyone will agree, if you ask them directly, that nothing lasts. And yet almost everyone continues to live and choose and grieve as though certain things were supposed to last, as though their ending were an exception to a rule that applies to everyone else. There was once a potter in a small village beside a river, known across the region for the beauty of his work. Once each year, on the same day, he made a single bowl, more careful and more perfect than anything else he produced that season, glazed in blue, fired twice for strength. And once each year, on that same evening, he carried the bowl to the riverbank and set it into the current, watching it fill and sink and disappear beneath the water. His apprentice, newly arrived, could not understand this, and finally asked him why he destroyed the finest work of his own hands. The potter said, "Child, this bowl was never separate from the river. The clay came from its banks. The water that shaped it in my hands came from its current. I only borrowed these things long enough to give them a different form for a season. Giving the bowl back is not destruction. It is honesty." The apprentice asked whether it did not grieve him to lose the best thing he made each year. The potter said, "It would grieve me more to forget, even once, that I never owned it to begin with." You do not need to give away your finest bowls to understand what this potter understood. But you might ask yourself, quietly, which of the things you're holding most tightly right now were only ever borrowed? Your health, as it is today, was borrowed from causes and conditions that will keep changing regardless of your wishes. The people you love, however constant they seem, are borrowed too, moving through their own impermanence exactly as you move through yours. Even the version of yourself, reading or listening to this, the particular thoughts, the particular mood, the particular understanding you are forming in this moment, none of it will remain fixed. This is not meant as something to mourn before its time. It is meant as an invitation to hold what you have the way the potter held his bowl, with full attention and full tenderness, and without the demand that the river stop flowing, simply because something beautiful is floating on it. There is a strange comfort available here, if you allow it in, one that seems at first to contradict itself. The very fact that a morning will not stay is part of what allows you to be fully present for it, rather than distracted by an anxious effort to freeze it in place. A parent watching a child sleep does not love the moment less for knowing the child will wake and grow and eventually leave that particular smallness behind forever. If anything, the knowing sharpens the attention, the way cold sharpens the smell of rain. Impermanence, understood this way, is not the enemy of meaning. It is the very condition that makes meaning possible, since a moment that could never end would eventually stop asking anything of your attention at all. Lesson 3 is called suffering, and here it helps to be precise, because the word in its original teaching is broader and quieter than the English suggests. Suffering does not mean only the obvious pain of loss or illness or grief, though it includes these. It also names a subtler discomfort that runs beneath even pleasant experience, a background unease that most people rarely name because it rarely announces itself loudly enough to notice. There was a merchant who traveled often between towns and who always complained, gently, that his sandals never quite fit. He had them made by the finest craftsmen in his city, fitted precisely to his feet, and still, within a day of wearing them, something felt subtly wrong. A looseness at the heel, a tightness across the toes, never enough to stop him walking, never enough to explain clearly to the craftsman what needed changing, but enough that by evening his feet ached in a way he could not quite locate or name. He had new sandals made 3 times that year, each time certain this pair would finally feel right, and each time, within days, the same faint wrongness returned. An old traveling companion, watching him remove yet another new pair by the fire one evening, said, "Friend, I do not think the trouble is in the leather. Perhaps no sandal will ever feel entirely right to a foot that expects perfect ease from something built to carry weight across rough roads. The ease you are hoping for was never going to come from better leather. This subtle unease, present even in comfortable lives, even in pleasant days, is part of what this teaching means by suffering. It is not a flaw in you if you notice it. It is not evidence that your life is somehow wrong or that you are doing something incorrectly. It is closer to the nature of conditioned experience itself. The way a foot in any sandal, however finely made, is still a foot walking on rough ground. Recognizing this is not meant to make you despair. It is meant to relieve you of an exhausting search, the search for the one perfect arrangement of circumstances that will finally remove all friction from being alive. That search, more than the friction itself, is often where the deeper tiredness comes from. You may have noticed this search in your own life without ever naming it plainly. A new arrangement, a new home, a new position, a new companion. Each one arrives carrying a quiet promise that this time the faint wrongness in the sandal will finally be solved. And each time, after the newness settles, some version of that same subtle unease finds its way back in, not because anything has failed, but because the unease was never truly located in the leather to begin with. Seeing this clearly is not cause for despair. It is, instead, a kind of relief, since it frees you from blaming this particular sandal, this particular life, for a wrongness that was never really about the fit at all. What remains, once the search for the perfect pair is set down, is simply walking, as steadily and as kindly as you can, in the sandals you already have. There is a difference worth naming here between accepting the subtle ache and being defeated by it. Acceptance, in this sense, is not resignation. It does not mean you stop caring for your feet, stop resting them when rest is due, stop seeking sensible improvements where they genuinely exist. It means only that you stop expecting the improvement to deliver something it was never able to deliver, a walk with no friction at all. The merchant in this story was not wrong to want comfort. He was only mistaken in believing comfort meant the complete absence of any sensation at all, rather than the ordinary, workable feeling of a foot doing what feet are built to do, carrying weight across uneven ground, one imperfect step after another. Lesson 4 is called the middle way, and it is perhaps the most practical teaching of all 9, because it applies to nearly every choice you will make today. It does not mean, as it is sometimes lazily translated, simple moderation, a little of everything, nothing too strong. It means something more precise. It means the tension that allows something to function fully, neither so loose that it cannot hold its shape, nor so tight that it breaks under its own strain. There was a farmer whose ox pulled his plow every morning through hard clay soil. For years he fitted the yoke loosely, believing this was kindness to the animal. But the ox, given too much freedom in the harness, wandered from the furrow, wasted its strength pulling sideways, and by midday was exhausted without having plowed a straight line. Believing he had been too gentle, the farmer then fitted the yoke tightly instead, cinched hard against the ox's shoulders, certain that firmness would produce discipline. But the ox, now chafed and in pain at every step, pulled unevenly, favoring its wounds, and by midday could barely move forward at all. It was an old worker in the field, watching both seasons pass, who finally showed him the third way. A yoke fitted close enough to guide the ox's full strength directly into the furrow, but never so tight that the animal's shoulders were made raw. The ox worked this way, plowed longer and straighter than it ever had under either extreme. The farmer had believed his only choices were looseness or force. He had not considered that the yoke could simply be fitted correctly. You may recognize in your own life some version of this same false choice, the sense that you must either indulge something completely or deny yourself entirely, that discipline and ease are opposites rather than a fitting to be found. Grief handled this way is neither suppressed entirely nor endlessly indulged, but given its true weight and no more. Ambition handled this way is neither abandoned nor allowed to consume every hour, but harnessed toward what actually matters and released from what does not. The middle way is not weakness disguised as balance. It is precision, the same precision the old worker used to fit a yoke that let the ox's full strength finally reach the ground. It is worth noticing how often the mind offers only 2 options, when in truth a third has simply not yet been searched for. Work either consumes every hour or is abandoned altogether. Rest either happens rarely and guiltily or stretches into a kind of numbness that helps no one. Speaking your mind either means saying nothing at all or saying everything without care for how it lands. In each case, the middle way is not a compromise between 2 poor choices, a little of each, unsatisfying in both directions. It is a third thing entirely, found only by paying close attention to what the actual situation requires, the way the old worker paid attention to the actual shoulders of the actual ox in front of him, rather than to some general idea of what a yoke ought to look like. This is perhaps why the middle way cannot be handed to you as a fixed rule to apply the same way in every season. The fitting that suited the ox in spring, when the ground was soft and its strength full, was not the same fitting that suited it in late summer, tired from months of steady work. What was moderate for you a year ago may be indulgence now, or may, just as easily, have become too severe, depending on what has changed in you since. Finding the middle way is less like memorizing a measurement and more like the old worker's habit of checking the yoke each morning against the animal actually standing in front of him that day, rather than the animal he remembered from the week before. Lesson 5 is called mindfulness, and it is often mistaken for something more complicated than it is. It does not mean forcing the mind to be empty or achieving a permanent state of calm that nothing can disturb. It means simply watching what arises in your experience with steady attention before rushing to chase it away or pull it closer. There was once a gatekeeper at the edge of a small village who took his duty with great seriousness. Every stranger who approached the gate, he questioned harshly, demanding to know their business, often turning them away before they had finished speaking, certain that any unfamiliar face might bring trouble to the village he was sworn to protect. By evening, he was always exhausted, having spent the whole day arguing at the gate, and still, somehow, trouble occasionally slipped past him anyway, disguised in ways his suspicion had not anticipated. An old woman who had watched him for years finally said to him, "Child, you do not have to fight with everyone who approaches this gate. You only have to see clearly who they are. Some will pass through and cause no harm at all if you simply let them walk by unremarked. Some will need to be stopped, and you will know which, if you are not already exhausted from fighting the ones who never needed fighting at all." The gatekeeper began, slowly, to change his practice. He still watched every traveler closely, but he no longer met each one with the same immediate alarm. Some he greeted plainly and let pass. Some he still turned away, but calmly without the exhausting anger of before. By the end of each day, he found he had far more strength left, not because fewer strangers came, but because he had stopped treating every arrival as a battle. Your own mind produces travelers all day, thoughts, moods, memories, fears, arriving at the gate of your attention without invitation and often without warning. Mindfulness does not ask you to block the gate entirely, an impossible task that would exhaust anyone who attempted it. It asks you to watch clearly who has arrived before deciding whether this particular visitor requires action or simply requires noticing. Many of your hardest days are made harder not by the thoughts themselves, but by the exhausting habit of treating every single one as an emergency requiring your full alarm. The gatekeeper who watches calmly protects the village at least as well as the one who fights at every arrival and finishes the day with far more left in him. Try sometime today simply naming what arrives at your own gate without immediately deciding what it means about you or what you must now do in response. A worry arrives, and instead of following it down every road it wants to lead you, you might simply note, "Worry," here again, and let it stand a moment at the gate before deciding whether it needs to come further in. A memory arrives uninvited, and instead of reliving it fully, you might note, "Memory," and allow it to pass. The way the gatekeeper allowed a harmless traveler to walk on through without ceremony. This is not indifference. It is the same clear seeing that let the old gatekeeper rest at the end of each day, having spent his strength only where strength was actually needed. Lesson 6 is called right speech, and though it sounds like a simple rule about manners, it is in fact one of the deeper practices, because words, once spoken, cannot be called back into the mouth that released them. There was a village built around a deep well, the only reliable source of water for miles, and the villagers understood that water drawn carelessly could flood a field or drown a young plant meant only to be watered gently. A woman in this village angry at a neighbor over some small dispute, drew a bucket of gossip about that neighbor, an accusation she had heard secondhand and had not troubled to confirm, and poured it out among the other villagers at the market. Within days the story had traveled far beyond her intention, reaching the neighbor's own children, causing a harm the woman had not meant to cause and now could not undo. She went to an elder, distressed, asking how she might draw the water back into the well. The elder said, "You cannot draw poured water back into a well, no more than you can return a flood to its source once it has already found the low ground and settled there. What you can do is consider, the next time you lift the bucket, whether what you are about to pour will nourish a field or drown one. That question, asked before pouring, is the only tool you truly have, because there is no tool at all for after. You have likely felt both sides of this teaching, the sting of words spoken about you that could not be recalled once released, and the quieter, harder to notice weight of words you yourself released too quickly, without asking first whether they were true, whether they were needed, whether the moment called for them at all. Right speech does not ask you to fall silent out of fear. It asks you to draw your water with the same care the villagers gave their well, considering the field before you pour, since no elder anywhere has ever discovered a way to call spoken water back. This applies as much to the words you speak to yourself as to the words you speak about others, though it is easy to forget that the well serves both directions. A harsh word about your own failings, repeated often enough in the quiet of your own thinking, floods a field just as thoroughly as a harsh word spoken aloud about a neighbor. Before pouring that water, either outward or inward, the same question serves you well. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it useful to say this now, in this way, to this person, including when that person is yourself? This is not a demand for constant gentleness, regardless of circumstance. Sometimes a field needs a hard truth poured onto it plainly. But even then, it is worth choosing the words the way the wiser villagers chose their water, with the field in mind, and not only the satisfaction of the pouring. There is often a brief pleasure in pouring quickly, in the sharp relief of saying the cutting thing the moment it arrives, and this pleasure is part of what makes right speech difficult to practice consistently. The satisfaction of the pouring is immediate. The flooding of the field, if flooding occurs, is usually noticed only afterward, once the water has already found the low ground and settled there. This is not a reason for endless hesitation before speaking, which brings its own kind of harm, the harm of words that were needed and never arrived in time to help. It is only a reason to become familiar with that particular fast pleasure, and to recognize it as a signal worth pausing over, rather than a signal to trust blindly. Lesson 7 is called Right Association, and it is often the least comfortable of these lessons, because it asks you to look honestly at the company you keep, not with judgment toward the people themselves, but with honesty about what certain conditions do to a person growing within them. There was a young sapling planted with good intention, close beside a great old tree already established in that soil, wide and strong and full of shade. The gardener who planted it believed the sapling would benefit from the elder tree's shelter, from its established roots, from its protection against the harshest winds. Instead, season after season, the sapling grew crooked, twisting sideways in a long, straining reach for whatever light managed to slip past the elder tree's canopy. Its trunk bent nearly parallel to the ground before it ever found enough open sky to grow upward. A traveling gardener passing through years later suggested the young tree be moved to open ground among saplings of similar age and size, where the light would reach it evenly from all directions. Reluctantly, the first gardener agreed. Within 2 seasons in its new place, the crooked sapling had begun, slowly to straighten, no longer forced to twist itself sideways, simply to find enough sun to survive. This story asks nothing of you regarding blame. The elder tree in this story did nothing wrong. It simply grew as elder trees grow, wide and shading, following its own nature. The lesson is not that certain people are villains to be avoided. It is that certain conditions, however unintentionally, can shape a person crooked over time, and that noticing this honestly, and choosing, where you are able, the company and conditions that let you grow straight, is not disloyalty or coldness. It is simply the same clear seeing the second gardener offered, a recognition that light reaches some places evenly and other places only in a thin, difficult slant, and that a young tree deserves, where it can be arranged, the ground where it will not have to twist itself simply to survive. You might ask yourself, gently and without any need to act immediately on the answer, where in your own life you have been growing sideways for a long while, reaching for light that some other presence, however unintentionally, has been taking for itself. This is not an invitation to catalogue grievances against the people around you. Many of them, like the elder tree, are only doing what their own nature does, spreading shade because shade is simply what a wide tree casts. It is, instead, an invitation to notice your own crookedness honestly, and to consider, where you are able, moving your roots toward ground where growing straight will not cost you quite so much effort. Lesson 8 is called non-self, and it is the most difficult of the 9 to hold steady in the mind, because it does not ask you to believe you do not exist. It asks you to look closely at what you have been calling yourself, and to notice how much of it is a name given to something that is always, quietly, in motion. There was a sailor who tied a particular knot into a length of rope each evening before sleeping, a habit passed down from his father, meant to keep the rope from tangling overnight. He had a name for this knot, one his father had taught him, and he spoke of it as though it were a distinct thing, checking each morning that the knot had held. One evening, teaching a younger sailor how to tie it, the boy asked him, "Where does the knot go once you untie it in the morning?" The old sailor paused, realizing he had never considered the question. He untied the rope slowly, and there, in his hands, was simply rope again, whole, unchanged in its material, with nothing missing from it and nothing extra added by having been a knot the night before. The knot had not gone anywhere, because the knot had never been a separate thing to begin with. It was only ever the rope, arranged for a while in a particular shape, given a name for convenience, and then arranged differently again. What you call yourself is closer to that knot than you may have been taught to believe. The body changes, cell by cell, across years. The feelings that seem to define you shift by the hour, sometimes by the minute. The thoughts you were certain were permanently yours a decade ago have in many cases already been untied and retied into something else entirely. This is not a frightening thing once it is truly seen, though it can feel frightening at first, the way loosening a knot might feel like losing something. But nothing was lost when the sailor's rope was untied each morning. It was simply, honestly, what it had always been beneath the name given to its temporary shape. You are not required to abandon your name, your history, your particular way of moving through the world. You are only invited to notice that beneath the knot there has always been something more spacious, more continuous, and less fragile than the knot alone ever was. This is, in the end, a quiet kind of relief, though it can feel at first like a loss. So much suffering comes from defending a fixed idea of who you are, as though the knot itself were under threat every time circumstances asked you to change shape. A failure feels catastrophic, partly because it seems to say something permanent about the knot called you, rather than simply describing one shape among many that the rope has taken and will go on taking. Seeing this does not erase your particular life, your particular history, the particular way you have learned to move through the world. It only loosens the grip of the idea that this shape, the one you are in right now, is the only shape the rope was ever capable of holding. Consider how much of your own suffering, looked at honestly, comes from defending a knot rather than tending the rope beneath it. Someone questions a belief you hold, and the questioning feels, for a moment, like an attack on your very existence, rather than what it actually is, a small tug at one particular knot among many the rope has worn over the years. Someone points out a mistake, and the correction lands as though your whole worth has been threatened, rather than one small shape briefly reconsidered. None of this is foolishness on your part. It is simply what happens when a temporary arrangement forgets, for a while, that it was only ever temporary. The old sailor's rope did not fight to keep its knot. It simply allowed itself to be untied each morning, and found each time that it had lost nothing in the untying. Lesson 9, the last of these 9, is called compassion, and it is fitting that it comes last, because every lesson before it eventually leads back here to the question of how you meet suffering, your own and everyone else's, once you have seen it clearly. There was a physician in a town struck by a lingering illness that spread from house to house one difficult season. At first, he treated the sick from a careful distance, his hands trembling, his stomach turning at the sight of open wounds, driven mostly by duty and a fear that he himself might fall ill if he came too close. Over the long months of that season, something in him changed, not his caution, which remained sensible and unchanged. Washing his hands, covering wounds properly, resting when his body demanded rest, but the feeling beneath his caution. He began to notice, tending each new patient, that the fragile body before him was made of the very same fragile matter as his own, that the fever burning in a stranger's skin was not so different from fevers he himself had survived as a child. His hands, still careful, still following every sensible precaution his training had taught him, grew steadier and warmer, not because the danger had lessened, but because his fear of the danger had slowly given way to a plain recognition of shared vulnerability. Where once he had recoiled, he now simply tended, efficiently, gently, without needing to pretend the sickness was something happening only to other people, separate from himself. Compassion, understood this way, is not the abandonment of sense or boundary. The physician did not stop protecting himself. He simply stopped needing his fear to do the protecting for him. This is worth returning to, because compassion is so often mistaken either for a soft sentimentality that ignores real danger, or for a hardness that mistakes distance for strength. Neither is what this teaching points toward. Compassion is what remains once you have looked honestly at your own fragility and stopped being surprised to find it mirrored in everyone else. It does not require you to fix what is broken in another person, and it certainly does not require you to fix what is broken in yourself before you are permitted to feel it. It only asks that you stop treating suffering, wherever you find it, as evidence that something has gone specially wrong reserved only for the unlucky, and begin to recognize it instead as the shared, ordinary weather of being alive in a body that ages and a heart that loves things it cannot keep forever. Think of how differently the physician's early months would have gone had he simply forced himself to feel warmly toward his patients before he was ready, pretending tenderness he did not yet have. That kind of forced compassion tends to crack under the first real strain, because it was never built on genuine seeing, only on the idea that he ought to feel a certain way. What actually carried him through was slower and less impressive to describe. A gradual accumulation of small moments in which his own fragility became undeniable to him, until warmth arrived, not as an effort, but as the simple, unforced result of finally seeing clearly. Compassion built this way tends to hold through long seasons and difficult patience, in a way that compassion built only on obligation rarely does. Notice, too, that this same compassion is owed to yourself, and not only to the strangers arriving sick at your door. Many people find it far easier to extend the physician's tenderness outward than to turn it toward their own fear, their own slowness to heal, their own moments of recoiling from difficulty before finally softening into steadiness. You are permitted the same gradual unfolding he was permitted, from fear toward tenderness, without treating the early fear itself as some kind of failure. Compassion for yourself is not indulgence, and it is not the abandonment of the sensible precautions that keep you well. It is simply the recognition offered to yourself as readily as to anyone else that a fragile body doing its best in difficult conditions deserves steady hands rather than harsh ones. This brings you back to where this began, to a man who lost his mother before he ever knew her voice, who tried starving himself into peace and found only more suffering waiting on the other side of hunger, who suffered from illness and grief and betrayal across a long life, and who still died, in the end, from an ordinary illness following an ordinary meal, exactly as any of us might. He was never spared. That was never the promise, and it is not the promise offered to you here either. What changed in him was not the presence of pain, but his relationship to it, the loosening of the hand around the flowering tree, the willingness to let the potter's bowl return to the river, the recognition that the ache in the sandal was not a personal failing, the yoke fitted with care instead of fear or force, the gatekeeper who stopped fighting every arrival, the water drawn thoughtfully before it was poured, the sapling moved into honest light, the knot untied without grief for a self that was never separate from the rope to begin with, and the physician whose hands grew steady, not by hardening, but by finally understanding how much he shared with the very people he was tending. Consider how ordinary his final days actually were, once you strip away the reverence that later grew up around them. He was old. He was tired. His body, like every body, had begun its long return to the earth it was borrowed from, exactly as the potter's bowl returned to its river. He ate a meal offered in kindness, fell ill from it as anyone might, and spoke gently to those gathered around him, reminding them, in his last recorded words, that all conditioned things pass away, and that steady effort was the task left to them now that he would not remain to guide it further. There is no record of him raging against this ending, and no record either of him pretending it did not hurt. Both things, it seems, were simply allowed to be true at once. The pain was real. The peace was also real. Neither one canceled the other. None of this is offered to you as a set of instructions that will end your own suffering, because that was never truly offered to anyone, not even to him. It is offered instead as a companion for the ache you already carry, a suggestion that the ache itself may not be the enemy you have long believed it to be. Perhaps this week you might notice one place where your hand has closed too tightly around something that was only ever passing through. It might be small, a plan that must go exactly as arranged, or feel ruined. A habit of checking whether a particular person still feels the way you need them to feel. It might be larger, an old idea of who you are supposed to be, defended long after it stopped fitting the person you have actually become. Whatever it is, there is no need to force it open all at once. Notice it without judgment, the way the old gatekeeper learned to notice a traveler without immediately reaching for alarm. Ask it the same quiet questions he learned to ask his own pain. What is this made of? Will it stay as it is? And if it will not, can I hold it a little more gently than I have been holding it until now? You will not become him by asking these questions. You're not required to become anyone other than who you already are. You are only invited, the way every listener before you has been invited, to suffer a little less, not by escaping what it means to be alive, but by finally meeting it the way he did, plainly without the second arrow, one ordinary day at a time.